One of my favourite sayings in the Pirkei Avot is turn it, for everything is in it. Reflect on it and grow old and grey with it. Well, I've done the grey bit anyway. Maybe it's just because I love the sage's name who said it. His name is Rabbi Ben Bagbag. Yes, it's a gorgeous name. And his friend is Rabbi Hey Hey. I have a feeling they may not be real. But he lived in the 1st century, according to commentary. Or maybe I love the saying because I just enjoy trying to find new meanings in the text of the Torah. Sometimes, of course, it's pure desperation looking for the readings. After all, today we were reading the piece that is normally read on 2nd day Rosh Hashanah. And a group in my congregation studied it to death this year. So, how can I read it again? How can I find something in it that's new for me, let alone for anybody else? So I had a certain panic when I looked at it. What else can I say? So of course I looked up sources and discovered that Paul, of all people in the 1st century, allegorized the expulsion of Hagar to argue that his rivals should be expelled from his nascent church. A lesson later applied by Christians to their own Jewish and Muslim rivals. But that didn't feel a relevant message for us. And then I looked at Ramban, Nachmanides, 13th century, who used the same biblical story to explain why Jews of his day were persecuted. In fact, the only positive I could get from those older commentators were that there is an assumption engraved in Judaism and Christianity alike that biblical stories speak to present-day circumstances, or at least they should do. Nachmanides wrote, "Everything that involves the ancestors is a sign for their descendants. For this reason, Scripture writes extensively about their journeys, digging wells, and other incidents. The reader likely considers these narrations to be trivial, without benefit. But all of them teach us about the future, since when one of these things happens to one of the 3 patriarchs, the reader can consider it carefully and derive from it what will happen to his descendants." But of course, wrestling with the texts and their commentaries and trying to make sense of them for today's challenges in our lives can, as we know, be a way of bolstering morally dubious claims. And we see far too much of that. But it can also be a rewarding and important process in our own sorting out of moral values. When we have a challenging text like we have this morning, that goes on into even more challenging texts where Hagar and Ishmael are thrown out, and where Abraham takes a knife to kill his son, then we have to confront these texts, but to be careful what prejudices might influence us in the results of our contemplation, and of course be aware of what's happening around us. So our text. Reading through the Abraham narratives, I actually found myself reminded about our world indeed. It just seems more chaotic and challenging, the world, than usual. True, for some of us, there's been very little change in personal lives, mostly working from home still and avoiding being with too many people, being in something of a bubble. That's true for many, I think. But the bubble seems to be bursting. And for others, they've witnessed incredibly massive changes, often to the very source of their being: jobs, homes, and very importantly, their own health and that of their friends and family. And as for the political world, crazy world out there. So we look and hope for guidance. Well, I must admit, I don't think I would have liked Abraham very much. But just think how chaotic his life was, full of twists and turns. He's called to God to leave his homeland and go to the promised land. But then he has to leave it twice because there's famine. He's promised he's going to be the father of many, but he had no kids for a long time. And then he had to send his firstborn by Hagar, Ishmael, into exile, and believed he'd been told by God he had to slit the throat of his firstborn by Sarah, a sacrifice to a God that had promised him descendants as many as the stars in the sky and the sand of the shore. And afterwards, there seems to have been a breach in their relationship. Isaac didn't go home with his father. I wonder why. Yes, I mean, why would Isaac want to leave home of a knife-wielding father? And then his beautiful wife Sarah, he had to rent out twice to save his own life. And then his actions over the Akedah, his willingness to sacrifice their son, leads to her death. And yet, according to the stories, he faced these stories, these changes with equanimity, calmness of spirit, based on his faith in God. So we must remember the positives, the important things that his life brought to us, teaching us about hospitality, bringing strangers into our homes. And despite the expulsion of Hagar and the Akedah, he did care very much for his orphaned nephew Lot. He stood up for him against the cruel people of Sodom and Gomorrah, and even went to war to save him from a rival clan. And of course, through him, we began our relationship to the land. And more importantly, he never gave up on what he felt was his primary mission, to bring a new faith, to banish idols. He brought the challenge of the worship of the one God to us and to the world. Despite all the chaos in his life, he never gave that challenge up. So maybe there's a lesson for us in this topsy-turvy world that we're in, where plan A keeps being turned on its head. And at the moment, many of us hope that will soon happen, and we'll quickly go to plan B or C or D or whatever it is that they've decided to come up with. I remember a sign outside a church that I used to drive by. It said, unlike the local traffic wardens, God never minds U-turns. So there's many twists and turns and changes, but Abraham taught us through the way he approached his life that yes, he did many things that seem wrong to us, made really bad choices, as do we all. But he never gave up on the good and positive mission he had to make this world a better place, where strangers are welcome, where the poor and vulnerable are cared for, where peace is sought. Because if there is just one God, then we are all the children of that same God. And we too must try to hold on to positive, longer-term missions in our lives.